So I have the task to introduce our next speaker, which is Dr. Phillip Birch from Western Sydney University. Phil's been a great supporter for community corrections over many years, and he's been a wealth of support for the New South Wales Probation and Parole Officers Association, and now he's come to present at Paccoa. Phil began his career as a full-time lecturer in the Division of Criminal and Community Justice at the University of Huddersfield, UK, between 2006 and 2009, contributing to both honours,
a policing degree and a criminology
degree, as well as teaching into the master's program. Throughout his academic career, he's been involved in the supervision of honours master's students. And prior to entering full-time academia, he worked in the field of corrections. So he comes from the community corrections background in the UK. So he's pretty much learned it from the ground up. He's published internationally, including books, chapters, peer review articles, government reports, in his main areas of research being offender management and rehabilitation, police, prisons, and probation. Gender symmetry, violence, and particular focus on DFV sex work, and secured over $790,000 in research grants. When's that party started? And he is the head?
I oversee two degree programs.
Police and Criminal Justice, and Policing and Criminal Justice program at University. Western Sydney University, because they've changed their name slightly. Anyway, without further ado, Phil Birch.
Thank you very much. It's great to be here, and I'm really thankful that actually what I've been able to present today is literally hot off the press. It's a study that I completed a few months back that we've managed to analyse in time for the conference with my long-term research partner, Professor Jane Ireland, which some of you may have met and may know of her work, and also Johan Colsty, who's part of ACON, which is a New South Wales-based health organisation for the LGBTI community. Really nice to be here. Is it me, or is there just a lot of men outside cutting grass? It just feels like there seems to be a lot of keen gardeners around, doesn't it, in Canberra, do you know what I mean? I was like, lots of people cutting grass. So, anyway, I just thought I needed to make that observation, because it really stood out for me. So, as I said, hot off the press, what I want to do today is talk about probably the most researched aspect of domestic family violence, that being inter-partner violence, but the most neglected aspect of that most researched area is within the LGBTI community. And so that's going to be the focus of my presentation today. It's based on an empirical study, as I mentioned, where we obtained a sample of 287 LGBTI community members in order to look at a particular aspect of inter-partner violence, that being emotional distress. And what I'm hoping that we'll be able to take away today is not only the findings that you might be able to think through in terms of your practice and its delivery, but I think the data set actually provides us with some maybe new forms of questioning when we're working with our clients around inter-partner violence. And so we're going to focus in particular on emotional distress and protective factors. And I'm going to unpack some of that because some of this within this most researched area is neglected too. I think it's important to contextualise the issue and the extent of inter-partner violence. And I'm not sure whether you have seen this, but it was published in the ABC by the ABC a few months back, and I was teaching in America in August, Dallas. It sounds very glamorous, actually, it quite was actually. But they were quite surprised at these figures. Now, if there's South Australians in the room, you might be able to help me here, but I do think there's an error on this table from the ABC, that being the 2016 range. I'm just wondering whether that's actually 2015 like the rest of the country, because it seems 25,000 numbers reported to the police in April, from January the 1st till April, mid-April seems a bit excessive to me. However, it might be more accurate than we actually think. But I think the percentage change, I think, is what's of interest there. And so what we can categorically say is that there is a social problem here that needs addressing. I think it's important to acknowledge that men and women are victims. I make no apologies for coming from my research perspective of aggression from a gender and sexuality inclusive position. And I think these figures kind of support the need for us to understand that violence, I think it's important that we acknowledge and recognise that victims can cut across the board here. And I'm going to pick up on that point later on, because I think there's some merit in looking at perpetration and victimisation together. However, in relation to this research, it is limited when we take into account the LGBTI community. And there I've just noted a few recent studies around the LGBT area in relation to domestic and family violence. But if we unpack that a little bit more, what we actually start to see is the real underrepresentation of the LGBTI community in this area of study. So for example, Edwards et al., 3% of 14,200 studies have actually looked at the LGB community. So actually transgender and intersex are completely ignored and overlooked. And here is just some research that identifies the prevalence, for want of a better phrase, to which LGBTI community members are subject to interpartner violence. And the range between that victimisation is quite extent. I really like the work of Erica Bowen, who started to unpack this in some detail. But in particular in this 2012 study, she really does acknowledge the range of victimisation that's been reported, in particular for male homosexual victims. The other criticisms of kind of this research, if you want for a better phrase, is the weakness in terms of methodology. So they are subject to small samples, self-reliant, self-reporting studies. Also, there's a problem in how sexuality and gender is actually being measured and recorded. For example, pansexual is usually missed off the list when we start to look at sexuality. Other criticisms of the research around interpartner violence, across the board, not just LGBTI, is the focus on the more severe forms of interpartner violence, sexual abuse, physical abuse, even psychological abuse. But what we do see is a limitation or a limited attention paid to the more subtle forms of aggression, such as the full range of emotional abuse that people may encounter in these intimate relationships. We are starting to unpack emotional abuse in terms of interpartner violence research. For example, myself with Jane Ireland in 2013 looked at male and female rates of victimisation around emotional abuse. In other parts of the aggression literature, we start to see emotional abuse has been kind of well researched around bullying, for example. But this is particularly problematic, the under-researching of emotional abuse, in particular with the LGBTI community, because of the research that's been done around the LGBTI community, verbal abuse, emotional abuse, is the types of abuse that is commonly reported. So Kelly, for example, in 1997, found that 95% of gay and lesbian their sample actually used verbal abusive tactics with their partners. In more recent research, in 2007, verbal abuse was reported to be the most common form of interpartner violence subjected to by the LGBTI community, followed by physical violence, unwanted sexual activity. Again, unpacking the idea of this emotional abuse, we can see here with Terrell in 2000, 83% of gay men reporting experiences of emotional abuse in their relationship. But we do acknowledge that there is a lot of multiple forms of aggression that people experience in intimate relationships. Unpacking some of the research that's been done around the LGBTI community, for example, Black in 2011 reported that 44% of lesbian women, 61% of bisexual women reported experiences of rape, physical violence and stalking by their intimate partner across a lifetime. That was compared to just 35% of heterosexual women. And similar figures, albeit a little bit lower for gay men, bisexual men, they were higher than the heterosexual community. I think a further challenge and a further limitation of the research that we have around inter-partner violence is the way that we've focused on risk factors, substance abuse for example, and we've overlooked protective factors. Risk factors such as substance abuse are important, also negative developmental life experiences, experiencing of child abuse, witnessing inter-partner violence within a family setting are all important. And when we drill that down further into the LGBTI community, we start to see some interesting patterns emerging. For lesbian women who have been subjected to child abuse or witnessed child abuse and abuse in their family setting, they're more likely to report being perpetrators of inter-partner violence compared to men who've experienced this type of abuse in childhood, who gay men are more likely to become victims. So we're seeing a difference here between the impact of these negative developmental factors. And for me, those differences really do suggest that it's important for us to examine perpetration alongside victimisation to really understand the complexities when we're unpacking inter-partner violence. Just to think through protective factors, what we're thinking about here is protective factors have been evidenced to reduce risk in relation to inter-partner violence, but we're looking at things like resilient traits, strong social support, good quality relationships. And let's hold that thought around good relationship quality, and we'll come back to that. But again, when we look at the research that's been done, the limited research around protective factors, again, we're starting to see that the LGBTI community has been neglected in this area. For example, Stith et al. In 2008 found that there was a significant negative relationship between marital satisfaction and partner violence. As you're more happy with your relationship, partner violence went down. But again, that was focused on heterosexual relationships, not the LGBTI community. So relationship satisfaction, social support have been commonly identified in the research as being protective factors that reduce the risk of inter-partner violence. Interestingly enough, resilience doesn't feature so much. It centres around relationship satisfaction and social support. When we bring that back down to the LGBTI community, we've got a problem here because arguably the support services that are in place for the LGBTI community just aren't there, or they're heterosexual focused. And I think one of the best examples to illustrate that with is with health screening assessments, where a lot of LGBTI community members feel excluded because of the heterosexual language that's used in those screening assessments. So, whilst we do have a lot of knowledge around inter-partner violence, it is limited around the LGBTI community, and therefore, arguably, it limits the effect in terms of intervention, treatment and assessment that we do with all our client groups. And so I think there's a need to develop further research around this area, and this is where the hot off the press research comes in. So our study with Jane and Johan aimed to address these gaps. And I think this, one of the strengths of, albeit a self-reporting sample, is that it didn't come from a specialist intervention programme or group. And the study focused on the gaps that were in the literature. So we wanted to examine, investigate the protective factors, as well as, such as relationship quality, as well as the aggravating factors such as emotional distress. And here are our three predictions. Positive association between reported abuse and emotional distress. Relationship satisfaction will moderate partner abuse and emotional distress, and resilient traits will moderate the relationship between partner abuse and emotional distress. Noting that previous research doesn't really offer much support for resilience as a quality. And here is a little bit about our study. So it was an online survey that was supported and distributed by ACON. So it was a national kind of survey that went out across the different states and territories through partnerships that ACON have. 381 participants started the survey, but as we get through the data set, I'll indicate that people dropped out. I think the data set, the online survey was a bit too big, but we'll look at that when we get to the meeting. And so when we get to actually looking at the abuse data set, we're just working with 287 participants across the board. There are a range of measures, and I think this is why people just looked and thought, maybe not, I'll go home instead. Several measures. A resilience scale to look at. Again, the effectiveness of these scales were kind of strong to excellent across the board. Probably the resilience scale was probably the lowest in terms of its kind of reliability measure. MMEA, a brilliant tool to use. There's a shorter version of 28 items. We use the 44, why not? We use 44, and what it does is it captures abuse in terms of what's happened to you as a victim, but also captures what you've perpetrated. So it's a really great measure. And without kind of just lading you as practitioners with more tools to use, and I'm not unsure how much flexibility you would have in kind of just whipping one of these out of the desk drawer if you felt the need, but there really would be some worth in this. And hopefully when we start to unpack the data set and we think about maybe new questions we can start to ask, maybe some of these measures might be useful for you to use when you're working with your clients. We added some questions in around support, seeking support and related kind of abuse, just some questions that we added in there. Then we looked at anxiety and depression through the HAD scale. And then we also looked at the relationship satisfaction, and then the PCLC is an emotional distress measure. So you can kind of work out that while we lost nearly about 100 people, it was a very large questionnaire. So what did we find? The joys. So the first thing was that the 35 age, more men than women identified themselves and answered the questionnaire. Sexuality-wise, predominantly LGB, with very few other. I think we had something like 11 intersex, and I think that in itself is worth a follow-up with maybe some qualitative stuff, because there's so much little out there on transgender and intersex. If we can identify them and do some stuff with them, that might be very useful. Nothing odd there about kind of like Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander breakdown. If I think back to the 2011 census, I think Aboriginal population was 4.6. We've got 4.2 there. So, you know, it's all within kind of a normal range. So, now I have got a handout for you. Got a little present. This should be enough there. And what it does is it presents to us the emotional abuse scale that looks at both victimisation and perpetration. 44 items are there. Now, I was going to do double-sided and stapled, but then I came to the realisation it was either my photocopying or a pair of shoes, and the pair of shoes won. So I went for a small version here. When you get it, you can actually see it, okay? So it is worthwhile. Also, there's reference down there to our wider study. It's currently under review in the Journal of Emotional Abuse, so you should be able to get hold of this article in a much more succinct way, hopefully in a few months' time. So, I'll let you look at that gift from me in your own time, but it really does offer some insight into evidence to support looking at victimisation and perpetration offered by a person. I'll let them just get around. Okay, we've got a copy. There should be enough. I think I did 110. Left a pair of socks behind. So then the questionnaire moved on to looking at what support people sought. as a perpetrator and as a victim. And here what we can see is more people are seeking support as a perpetrator than they are as a victim. There's something quite optimistic about that for me. Now, how that seeking support has come about, whether it's something that the individual's decided for themselves or being encouraged by their partner, there is something, we've still got a way to go, but it's interesting to see how there's more people seeking support for the perpetration than they are for a victimisation. And again, that might have something to do with kind of support systems and how the LGBTI community perceives support out there. However, and again, I'm sure there's some geographical difference with this, the police always seem to come out quite good in terms of feedback from the LGBTI community in terms of support received and how they've been dealt with. And I always think there's something quite needed to offer that kind of evidence, because I think they're the first ones to get kicked in the criminal justice line, the police. I'm sure that there is improvement that can be made all the time everywhere, but I think they do a lot of good stuff too, and I think it's worth noting that. And we'll unpack that in a second. So, in terms of support, as perpetrator or as victim, the family is the first place, or the main place, that people are seeking this support, and then the rest is pretty much self-explanatory. However, 65% of those are trying to solve the problem themselves, which is always a little bit worrying, isn't it? Self-diagnosis and all. Of those reporting abuse, over half of the sample have been in previous relationships that have experienced abuse. I think that's important to acknowledge, but I also then think it's really important to look at this and how we talked about up front this idea of the subtle, the less physical kind of types of violence are researched, but actually the reporting of what's happening to people is the subtle, the indirect, so on and so forth. And I'm just not sure that we always recognise that. And potentially victims and perpetrators aren't necessarily always recognising that there are types of interpartner violence. Property, physical, sexual, lower down the scale there. What's interesting as well is when we looked at childhood experiences of similar behaviour, the sample had witnessed or been subjected to as a child similar types of victimisation. It's interesting, I've got a PhD student at the moment, and she's looking at child abuse, multiple forms of child abuse, and she's documenting the first one. She works for New South Wales Police, she's got the data from New South Wales Police, and she's documenting that first report and then looking at when they come back into the system and how it can really be nipped in the bud. And we talk about multiple victimisations. And actually, there's a lot of triggers out there that can prevent incident 2, 3, 4 and 5. You know, there's one case out there, and this young person has got something like 46 reported cases against them. Do you know what I mean? And when you trace that back and you think about that first incident, it's interesting. But remembering too, that actually some of this experience as a child isn't necessarily leading to a victimisation, it's leading to perpetration, if you look at the work of Paccoa in 2011 and what they reported. And so really just a point there about actually this subtle indirect form of abuse, not necessarily the punch in the face. Then we moved into some further analysis, and we took the abuse scale, the MMEA, which you've all got a copy of there, and we generated factors. 3 factors that focus on victimisation, 3 that focus on perpetration, and as you would expect, they reflect each other. So there. We then, through univariate analysis, looked at gender and sexuality and found that there was no difference, aside from perpetration in relation to the 3rd factor, where we found that men were more likely to engage in the suspicious, possessiveness, threats to possessions, including threats to animals, more likely than the females, women who were less likely to report that. Regression analysis was then conducted on all 6 factors, and no significant predicting factors were identified. We then moved on to look at mental health, and by doing that, what we did is we combined 2 measures, the anxiety and depression scale and the PCLC scale. And we ended up with 3 factors. Factors 1 and 2 are really a combination of items from these 2 measures, where factor 3 is primarily solely from PCLC, looking at emotional distress. And then we move the examination on to look at overall partner victimisation and emotional distress. And I think this is where it starts to get really interesting and starts to kind of signal that, are we asking the right questions? Are we exploring things to the full extent? So, the first thing that we looked at was partner victimisation, emotional distress in relation to anxiety and hyperarousal. And what we found with this factor, factor 1, is that an increase in victimisation predicted higher levels of anxiety and hyperarousal. When we looked at this in relation to factor 2, so in relation to loss of excitement in the relationship, that kind of thing, there was no relationship found. However, increased victimisation was predicted with factor 3. There was no relationship found or no association found between victimisation and resilience. So again, it's coming back to this idea around the protective factors, relationship quality, social support, resilience. Resilience just isn't identified as much as we would probably expect it to be in the research. We then took the 3 factors and we looked at it in terms of current relationship satisfaction and found that it acted as a partial mediation. So, for example, in relation to factor 1, reduced perception in current relationship satisfaction contributed to the association between an increased level of victimisation and increased anxiety and hyperarousal. For me, that triggers a series of potential new questioning when working with a client. Do you love them? Do you hate each other? No. Okay. Are you happy in your relationship? Do we ask that question? Yeah. And so that would, for me, trigger off a series of questions about looking at are you anxious? And allowing us to explore other forms of interpartner violence that the client, may not identify as being forms of abuse. So the subtle forms. So I found that quite enlightening and really a practical takeaway, instant tool that we could potentially take away from this study. We found that the mediation effect between relationship satisfaction was also found between the loss of enjoyment, so factor 2 here, which wasn't associated with increased levels of victimisation when solely analysed by itself. When you take into account current relationship satisfaction, it actually impacts on the relationship there. I should have mentioned, there was no relationship between increased victimisation and factor 3, the intrusion of stressful events on its own. But when you introduce current relationship satisfaction, it does emerge. Yeah? So clearly, we're starting to see how relationship satisfaction is having a direct impact here on increased levels of victimisation, mental health, emotional distress. We then moved the analysis on and we started then to explore the victimisation factors from the MME, okay? There were 3 factors there, in relation to the mental health factors. Again, resilience was not predicted by any of these components. So again, effectively, our third prediction in terms of the method and the aims of the study are wiped out here. What we found in terms of the victimisation factor 2, is that again, emotional distress was associated significantly with abuse factor 2. Increased conflict predicted higher levels of anxiety and hyperarousal. And again, when we look at relationship satisfaction, the reduction in that satisfaction again increased that association. Essentially, factor 2 predicted higher levels of both loss of enjoyment and intrusion. And again, that partial mediation between current relationship satisfaction accounted for both of these relationships too. When we look at that in relation to factor 1, again, a significant association with emotional distress components. Increased hostility became a predictor for increased levels of anxiety, the loss of enjoyment, and the intrusion. Again, you take into account partial mediation, relationship with current satisfaction of the relationship, and again, it's indicating an association. So we're starting to see how the current relationship satisfaction is playing a role here in terms of emotional distress and its relationship with victimisation. And we found a similar pattern with the victimisation factor 3, in which we are looking at, again, an effective relationship indicating that suspiciousness, possessiveness, social control is associated with these levels of mental health issues. So what does that all mean? What can we draw from that? Well, I think the first thing to acknowledge is that the study has captured a range of abuses that the LGBTI community experience. I think the diversity of abuse that's reported in this study does map onto other, albeit small number of research in the area, but it is adding to that growing body of research, and we hope to see that there will be more. It's interesting to note as well about emotional abuse, verbal aggression, emerging from this data set that potentially have been overlooked in previous research. No difference across gender and sexuality between these factors. I think that's quite an important one. And so shows some similarities potentially between the heterosexual communities too. What can we take away from this, and what is this suggesting? I think, and what we're concluding in terms of the researchers here, is how we may engage in more harm minimisation approaches when working with victims and perpetrators of interpartner violence. So there's a developing kind of school of thought, especially within the risk assessment literature, that focuses on accepting those engaged in abusive relationships who may wish to sustain them. That old classic, I do love them, I just want the abuse to stop. And so I think this a shift to harm minimisation and a focus on relationship enhancement involving both partners is probably where therapeutic interventions can move to, and how we can move forward with this issue. I think in the area there is a tendency to focus on dissolving relationships. It can be quite confusing for people to think, why would you want to stay with them? Again, we don't understand the benefits of why people are staying, and maybe some of those structural factors, finance for example, may be one of them, yeah? But certainly there is evidence to suggest that by injecting pro-social conflict resolution strategies into these relationships, increasing the quality of their relationship can address some of the abuse that they're experiencing within the relationship. So I suppose in sum what we're arguing is that a shift to harm reduction and relationship quality is what we should be focusing on in terms of informing assessment, informing treatment. I think it's worth mentioning again that the negative development life experiences as well that people are experiencing, and how that plays out in adulthood in relation to the LGBTI community. So how we are seeing that those experiences of child abuse, those witnessing of interpartner violence in the family setting as a child is influencing, for example, lesbian men and gay men in different ways. Again, resilience trait was not associated with partner violence in this study, so maybe we should be putting that one to bed, question mark, but certainly this focus on relationship satisfaction. there's an absence, it seems, in terms of the research around understanding this as an aggravating feature. However, it has been noted in heterosexual research that's focused on inter-partner violence. It's just never really been explored to a great depth and not really within the LGBTI community, but we are certainly seeing it here. And I think it comes back to this idea and this question of then, well, why are people, if we're advocating for harm minimisation, pro-conflict resolution, you know, it does beg the question, why are people wanting to stay in these relationships if they are of such low quality? It's unclear the gains from the relationships that these people are getting. Again, it comes back to maybe these structural factors, financial hardships, so on and so forth. But I think there's worth exploring in research barriers to ending relationships. The barriers to ending relationships now becomes of interest, a key component to examine what is stopping them from ending these relationships. And so I think that's what the research needs to move towards. I think the research now needs to move towards raising relationship quality and looking at how that can take place in more concrete terms with larger samples. And I do think that whilst there are some limitations to our study, for example, the sample size, it does have its merits. It does reflect existing research out there around the LGBTI community. There are elements of risk factors as well as protective factors that need further exploration, and examining whether what aggravating features, protective factors can help or hinder inter-partner violence, minimising it and reducing it and preventing it. But also this idea that's come from Farrington et al. Quite recently, and research that tries to capture promotive factors. So not just looking at high risk factors or protective factors, but some of those low level behaviours that sometimes get ignored and overlooked probably need some further explanation to see how they're contributing to this relationship. And so I'll leave it there. It is hot off the press. Hopefully the journal article will be out soon that will kind of delve deeper and give you a resource really to fall back onto. But there is certainly scope for a lot more work in and around this area, not only for the LGBTI community, but around these subtle emotional distress factors that play a role within these romantic relationships. Thank you very much. Cheers.
Questions? Silence?
No. When you've digested your 44-item treat, you'll be able to make some questions.
We have a question.
I was just wondering if there is anyone else doing this kind of research that you know of.
No, in some. We, Jane and I will be working with ACON later on in the year to explore some of these implications. As I say, it's only just been finished. So Jane's over again in November, so we'll sit down with ACON and think about how we can progress some of those. I'm particularly interested in these low-level behaviours that we sometimes overlook. We've seen this in the domestic literature for some times. I don't know whether you remember the SPECS risk assessment that was developed by a forensic psychologist in Britain, Laura Andrews, I think her name is. And she came up with these risk factors for DV, and there were like 6 of them: SPECS, separation, pregnancy, escalation. But what she did is she provided a whole host, a huge pamphlet basically, of other risk factors that were completely ignored. And actually what you started to find that if people were presenting with 10 of these, or a few of these low-level risks, they were blowing some of these so-called high-risk cases out the water. Do you know what I mean? And they were overlooked. So I do think there is something around this low-level behaviour that we are overlooking, and we do tend to focus on the kind of the more kind of severe forms. So that's where I would be wanting to take it really. Yeah.
Sorry, this gentleman's first.
I've got the power. Philip, I found your presentation very challenging in the sense of I've not necessarily come away from what you said with a clear understanding of what, if any, differences do you find between the LGBTIQ experience of in the domestic violence, family violence area, and the heterosexual experience of it. That's one thing. And the other one is your use of the term harm minimisation. So wanting to perhaps look at the option of conflict resolution, when in general I think the experience probably of most in this room would be that we don't treat domestic violence perpetrators, we don't see it as a relationship issue. We see it as a power and control and a violence issue that's got, and people being held to account. I just wonder if you want to comment on any of that.
Yeah. Well, the first thing is that I think there are some parallels being drawn between the heterosexual community and the LGBTI community, but there are maybe some subtle differences where potentially maybe some of that verbal aggression, which is highly commonly reported amongst the LGBTI community, is probably not number one on maybe some of the heterosexual kind of research that's been done. So there are similarities being drawn. We've come from a space here, going back to your second point, around not separating perpetrator and victim and actually looking at kind of the behaviours that people are engaged in these complex relationships. And in terms of the harm minimisation, what we're suggesting is that could be an avenue for exploring in relation to conflict resolution for these people.
Do you see any risks in going down that track?
In what way? You certainly have some.
Well, I suppose the main concern that people have is that it minimises the actual illegal. It tends to minimise the unlawful behaviour, so the violent behaviour, and it sees it, so rather than a person having to then to be accountable for the violence and the abuse that they are engaged in, that becomes a problem of the relationship. And so you put two people, into a context where they're engaged in conflict resolution, getting counselling or whatever, and that can become a further abusive experience for the victim.
Yep.
And the other thing would be that I suppose while we treat it that way, the possibility of further abuse or changed levels of abuse actually taking place in the relationship.
Maybe I didn't mention it, but it's certainly what we've acknowledged in the write-up of this research is that is a full range of abuses that people engage in, and that not all interventions and strategies are appropriate for each case. And so maybe more individualised kind of almost assessment, if you will, of a case. If someone is in a life-threatening situation, you're potentially not going to offer, as the first port of call, harm minimisation, let's meet up for a chat. So I think it's about looking at the types of abuses people are experiencing in their relationships, individualising that, and then thinking through what the best options are. But certainly in terms of some of this emotional abuse that people are experiencing, an effective strategy could be conflict resolution.
I think my question probably relates to the former man and what he was asking about. If you're going to focus on relationships and make it a relationship problem, not a problem of somebody abusing someone else. So I was kind of sort of wondering why you talk about emotional distress so much and you don't actually talk about that somebody is being emotionally abused, flip it around that way more. And I kind of felt like a little bit like when we're focusing on the relationship, we're kind of on that slippery slope of moving back to that it's just a domestic, it's just a problem in the home, it's not a problem of abuse, which isn't okay. Yeah?
Yeah, I don't think we're suggesting to minimise abuse or detract from that. What we're doing here is presenting an aspect of interpartner violence that people are both perpetrating, acknowledge, and also being victims to. And so there's actually some mutual kind of abuse going on in what's been reported in this data set. We're not suggesting for a fact that this is a holistic approach, a one-size-fits all. I think it's contributing to a battery, a suite of interventions that can be used, and comes back to this point about individualising the risk assessment that's done.
We're running out of time, so I'm just going to take one more question. This lady had her hand up first, so we'll just go with your question.
Sorry, I'm just going to be quick. I guess, yeah, I take your point that it's really an individual thing. And I think we've got to be really careful that we don't go too far in each direction on the pendulum, because we don't want to make the assumption that people want to end these relationships, because that's our idea of what we think they should do. But the other side of that is there are some, as you're saying, Phillip, there are some behaviours within relationships that are abusive and absolutely require further intervention and perhaps criminal proceedings. But there are other things that go on in relationships, which we've all probably experienced, that aren't necessarily to that extent that you want to be able to resolve in your relationship. And there's a fine line there between us putting our own judgment on that and prosecuting. And whilst I absolutely support that some things need to be prosecuted, there are other things where resolution is possible.
Thank you.
Great stuff. Thank you.